Welcome to part 5 of the Eisenhower era. Now we're going to take a look at the Cold War. Like Harry Truman before him, Dwight Eisenhower is a Cold Warrior president. His goal is to try and fight and win the Cold War, right? So, like for example, when Joseph McCarthy was making his outrageous allegations on his anti-communist campaign, despite the fact that Eisenhower hated the man, he refused to publicly criticize him. He refused to stop the execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right? He'll even deny J. Robert Oppenheimer his security clearance. This is the scientific head of the Manhattan Project, but because Oppenheimer had communist sympathies, he's going to have his security clearance revoked, and he's not going to be able to work at the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratories, right? He'll be even more aggressive than Truman when it came to what should happen to communism in the outside world. He says that Eastern Europe is a group of captive people, and communism needs to be rolled back whenever possible. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, is going to threaten instant massive retaliation with nuclear weapons in the response of any Soviet aggression. The military is going to take on what is called a New Look strategy. New Look is actually after a fashion line that was Mammy Eisenhower's, Dwight David Eisenhower's wife's favorite fashion. All right, it de-emphasized armies and emphasized an increase of nuclear weapons, an increase in long-range bombers and missiles and nuclear-powered submarines, right? The public was being prepared for potential nuclear annihilation. The Federal Civil Defense Administration are going to put together a series of guidebooks on how to protect yourself and survive a nuclear attack. They're going to release instructive videos like Bert the Turtle and his duck and cover. You'll see they'll do drills like this one here. Duck and cover, these guys are hiding under the desk. I remember when I was a kid in kindergarten, we still did these drills. My father was a nuclear engineer, and I had asked him, I said, what's the point of getting under the desk if there's an atomic bomb? And I remember him telling me, he says, nothing, you'll still die, right? But it does give you a sense of security. As a kid, I thought, oh, it must be because it's made out of wood, and I'll just burn faster. But really what it boiled down to, I mean, when there's a nuclear bomb going off over you, there's not a whole lot you can do. And certainly a wooden desk is not going to protect you from the impulse radiation and heat of a nuclear weapon. But it gives you a sense of feeling of control, right? That you're actually having control over a situation that you have no control over. Now, Eisenhower is going to be active in the Cold War, but when it comes to actually being in a direct confrontation with the Soviets itself, he's a little bit more timid than he will be when we take a look at the Third World here later. Now, we got to remember when we think of Eisenhower that he was the commander-in-chief of Allied forces in World War II, which means that he was the commander of the armies there in Western Europe that fought against the Nazis, and thousands of them died. That made him pretty adverse to the idea of getting in a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union or any of its immediate satellite nations that might turn hot. So, like, for example, the Voice of America, which is going to be a radio station established in Western Europe that broadcasts to Eastern Europe, it broadcasts anti-communist propaganda, is going to put the idea in the Hungarians' head in 1956 that if they rose up and revolted, that the United States would support them, right? They didn't say that directly, but the idea was out there, right? So on October of 1956, Hungary revolted against communist rule. Now, Eisenhower did nothing. He didn't respond to that. Like I said, he wasn't willing to risk a confrontation that would lead to a major escalation directly with the Soviet Union. And so this Hungarian Revolution of October of 1956 will be brutally crushed by Soviet forces. All right. Now, he did do other things to try and ease the tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. For example, on December 8, 1953, he's going to give a speech at the United Nations in which he called for an Atoms for Peace plan. He says that the United States and the Soviet Union need to work towards complete nuclear disarmament and the creation of an international atomic agency. And this international atomic agency would collect all fissionable material, all nuclear material, and then the agency would monitor and dole this material out for the use of energy or medicine or peaceful purposes only, right? Now, needless to say, the Soviets outright rejected this proposal, right? In 1955, when Eisenhower met with Nikita Khrushchev in Geneva, this is the first time there's going to be a meeting between these two nations since the different conferences during World War II. Eisenhower is going to propose the Open Skies Plan, in which he says that each side should have open access to fly over the other's territories. Now, the United States was already flying planes over the Soviet territories. They had the high-altitude aircraft called the U-2, right, that the Soviets, at least up to this point, could not shoot down. That'll change here in a few years, okay? This is kind of the groundwork for what Reagan would call the trust but verify policy, right? Now, again, what Eisenhower is proposing is that both sides should be allowed to fly spy planes over the others to verify that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. Of course, again, Nikita Khrushchev is going to outright reject this plan. And Eisenhower, honestly, probably would have never gotten this through Congress. The American public themselves probably never would have accepted this, right? But this was the extent of the effort that Eisenhower made as far as a direct confrontation with the Soviets. The tension between these two nations, though, are still pretty high, and you can really see this in July of 1959 when there was in Moscow a U.S.-Soviet cultural fair, right? It was kind of an expo for both nations, right? The United States sent a delegation led by the Vice President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon. Brought with them was a modern United States kitchen, an American kitchen that was fully stocked with all the new conveniences of life, right? At this expedition, Nixon and Khrushchev get into an argument over which economy and which form of government is better, right? Remember, this is left versus right. This is planned economies versus capitalism. This is communism versus democracy, right? Okay. Khrushchev is a fantastic political operator, and his favorite thing to do is goad somebody into a fight, into an argument. Because if he goads you into an argument, then he can own you, right? So he tells Nixon that the Soviets have only existed for 42 years, and in 7 years we will be equal to you in technology, and then we will pass you along the way, as he waves to the ground below him, right? Nixon, though, is a pretty good operator politically himself, right? Despite what we'll know about him later, Nixon doesn't take the bait, right? He tells Khrushchev that, well, you're speaking extemporaneously. He points out that I'm really happy you're doing this on this new innovation, color television, right? He's pointing out all these conveniences. Khrushchev counters. He says, your fascination with the new, your theory, it does not hold water. Don't you have a machine that puts the food in your mouth and then pushes it down? He says, many of the things you've shown us are interesting, but they're not needed for life. They serve no useful purpose. So these two men kind of spar off here in this kitchen debate, as it becomes called, right? With Khrushchev continually trying to goad Nixon into a heated argument, Nixon not quite taking the bait, just keep playing around the edges. And the most interesting thing, if you watch this, besides really getting to see the dynamic of the tension between the two sides, is watch the translator if you ever sit and watch these films, because you can see a few times that the translator becomes wickedly uncomfortable after Khrushchev says something, and he realizes, I have to now interpret this and say this to the Vice President of the United States.